Let's talk about potentially endless gunfights within one turn, mortar shells bouncing to and fro across the battlefield, and a few of the other examples of the weirdest rules of 40k 10th edition. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today I thought we'd take a look at some strangeness and rules technicalities, with a quick spin through a few of the weirdest rules in Warhammer 40k. Perhaps a few things that arise from technicalities in the game rules that might just be a little bit weird if you were to read about this sort of thing happening in the lore. Obviously in Warhammer 40k, the game that you're playing is an abstraction. There's always likely to be some clunkiness and odd situations arising from moving your armies in a turn-based mode around a tabletop. Perhaps the fact that one or another army just basically patiently waits for their entire opponent's army to move, shoot, and fight them in combat. That's just a little bit weird to start with in the first place. The intent of this video isn't really to be too negative or anything, just to take a fun look at a few of the stranger interactions in Warhammer 40k 10th. A few things that they might choose to alter or patch when they do the update and errata of the index rules, but a few things that are just kind of inherent to the way that they built the game, and are probably working as intended, even though some things are a bit strange. Quite a lot of these are things that I've been seeing as I've been going through the indexes, particularly things that you've been highlighting in comments, a few more things that were highlighted on a community post recently, and there's a couple of examples from Reddit as well. In any case, let's jump straight in. First up, we have an endless gunfight between two Hexmark destroyers, something that I think I might have seen on one of my Necron videos recently, thanks to the person who commented this one. The Necron Hexmark destroyer is really quite a powerful unit at the moment. It's quite good at defending a nearby Necron unit, as if it's within 3 inches of that unit, then it gets to fire back immediately if your opponent shoots at the unit that it's protecting. Its range is a little bit limited at 18 inches, but it could hopefully kill a few light infantry models if your opponent had them in range. Odd things can happen though if your opponent happens to be another enemy Necrons player and they have their own Necron Hexmark. Say you've got 2 monoliths on the table and one of them shoots at the other one. After it's resolved its damage, the Hexmark that's next to the monolith can open fire, maybe targeting the enemy monolith, and that could trigger the enemy Necron's Hexmark destroyer to fire back at the other one. You could basically trigger an endless gunfight where the Hexmark destroyers have to very slowly shoot through an enemy very tough vehicle, 6 shots at a time to try and slowly chip damage off them, each one repeatedly triggering the other one, as it doesn't look like there's any sort of rider to say that this happens to happen in, say, the enemy shooting phase, for example. It's just when the target is selected but for the target of a ranged attack. I do think that the model's a bit of a weirdly powerful unit, that it could potentially have unlimited shooting if your opponent just keeps on shooting at one unit that it's protecting. Just perhaps feels a little bit odd compared with having just a set damage output and operating somewhat similarly to the rest, or even just getting a single bonus round of shooting as a fair few other units can get. At the moment I'm not sure if they consider the Hexmark strong enough to actually want to patch and try and just limit it to 1 round of shooting or anything. I guess to a lot of units it's just not really the biggest threat in the world, and Necrons aren't exactly dominating the meta right now, so maybe the Hexmark will be able to keep its crazy reactive fire. Moving over to the Tyranids, and another strange rules quirk that I've seen discussed really quite a lot over the past day or two, is the odd case of the Tyranid Tyrannocytes, a Tyranid drop pod that can basically transport itself. I think this one might have gained a bit more traction as I saw a Reddit post about it on the competitive 40k page, plus a whole ton of you flagged it on the community post that I made as well. The Tyrannocyte is essentially the Tyranid drop pod, hurtles down from the upper atmosphere and deposits either a squad of 20 infantry or a monster with 12 wounds or less. Strangely though, the Tyrannocyte is itself a monster that's got less than 12 wounds, it's only got 10, so at the moment it looks like there's no restriction on putting a Tyrannocyte inside of another one, and then technically another one inside that. You can declare them all to be transporting each other, with I suppose the one on the inside having to actually transport something that isn't a Tyrannocyte, as none of them are allowed to be empty. It gives you a pleasing Russian dolls type effect for the Tyrannocytes, with clown car styles of further Tyranid monsters getting out of each other. Not exactly the best idea in game, to be honest. They're not really the thing that you'd most want to spam, and I guess that this is probably in the realm of things that might well get patched in the index errata. Next, one thing that's a bit more of a core feature of 10th edition game design is the way that keywords work with leaders and their bodyguard type units, and it can make a few units just very susceptible to certain anti-keyword weapons, say poison weapons that target infantry, or haywire weapons that target vehicles. When a leader attaches to a bodyguard unit, the unit gets the keywords of both, So perhaps one of the worst examples of this working in a fairly unhelpful way is when a datasmith attaches to a Castellan robot unit, theoretically quite a nice cheap support character that makes them significantly more dangerous, but by joining them he also gives them the infantry and character keywords, meaning that the Castellan robot unit that's already got the vehicle keyword will get hurt by most of the anti-weapon keywords in the game, whether it's Drukhari poison weapons, or Eldar haywire blasters, or anything that's got exotic rules against characters. I've seen at least a few people kind of concerned to take the datasmith and put him in the unit, given that he might make them a lot more susceptible to a bunch of weapons, and that might well not be worth the 35-point buy-in and the protocols. We're not quite done with the Castellan robots yet though. As well we're on them, I can't really help but mention the rule that can bounce enemy firepower back even when it's half a battlefield away. This one admittedly hasn't really changed all that much since 9th edition, but their lore is that these AdMech robots are protected by an energy field that bounces back enemy projectiles towards them, and you can imagine that coming into effect for say a bunch of energy weapons being fired at close range. They'd hit the Castellan robot and bounce off the force field, perhaps the odd shot damaging the unit that fired it. It now happens against any saving throws, including regular ones, not just invulnerables. And the rule is that for every 6 to save, the attacking unit suffers 1 mortal wound. Kind of weirdly though, there's no range clause on this whatsoever, so it means that even if you are fired at something by basically the entire table away, perhaps say an Imperial Guard mortar team loading some mortar shells behind the enemy lines, they fire their shells over at the Castellan robot, and then with a couple of lucky saves you might find a way to bounce the shell right back at the unit that fired it, perhaps a bit of a nasty surprise for the mortar team shooting him. It is kind of funny for certain units that don't have any native AP, that if they cause saves on the Castellan robots they might well die before the average killing one. Say if a set of 3 guard mortars just endlessly fired rounds at the Castellan robot, odds are the mortar team would die to their own firepower before they killed the Castellan robot. It doesn't really mean that they're strong for the points though. It's not a rule that's going to be a big deal against the big things like anti-tank shots, which are the main things that are going to be targeting big chunky robots like them in the first place. Next up, here's another rules interaction that I saw discussed on the Warhammer 40K competitive Reddit page a few days back as well. A strange interaction with eliminators that allows you to move, then shoot, then jump back into the transport, and then shoot again with their rifles once more. Units firing out of transports have had to have some bespoke rules many times in Warhammer 40k, and it seems that the way that Games Workshop's decided to realise it in 10th edition is that the weapons from the unit within just count as being equipped by the transport. If, say, a Space Marine Impulsor has firing deck 6, it means that the Impulsor can fire with 6 weapons from 6 different models within the transport. Say, for example, if it had some Hellblasters within it, it could count as being equipped with a bunch of Plasma Incinerators. For the vast majority of units, this works absolutely fine and doesn't cause any sort of strangeness, but the Eliminators seem to be a special case. They've got a weapon called the Instigator Bolt Carbine, and that gives them a special rule that allows them to move after shooting. That move is a normal move, and if you finish a normal move within embarkation range of a transport, it means that you can get back into that transport. So I believe that means that you can get the Eliminator Squad out of the Impulsor in your movement phase. In the shooting phase, fire the rounds and the Instigator Bolt Carbine, try and snipe an enemy character, use their secondary movements to get back into the Impulsor, and then because the Impulsor hasn't shot yet, it can fire with all of its weapons, and also the firing deck with the Eliminators embarked. This one's definitely not intended. I don't think that weird janky mechanics getting in and out of transports would give any reason for the Eliminators to be able to fire twice, at least by intent. Just seems like something that wasn't really considered when they got their second move rule, and the way that the firing deck rule doesn't have any proviso for units that have already shot, as most of them can't get back in transports afterwards. Again, I guess that this will probably be one of the ones that they patch when they do the index errata, and in the meantime probably not the best one to exploit, I'd say. Feels like a little bit of an abuse of a loophole more than anything else, though at the moment it does check out rules as written. One other thing that I found rather curious about the 10th edition rules is that while arguably vehicles and monsters have got a little bit more powerful while they're in combat, they're able to shoot out of it with all of their guns. I did find it kind of surprising that in 10th edition they haven't got any sort of specific Titanic rules to allow your models to fall back and shoot as they could before. In 9th edition, say if you had an Imperial Knight in combat with a lowly Gretchen, you'd be able to fall back, shoot all your guns, and then charge back into combat. The shooting from the core Titanic rules, the charging from a super heavy Walker rule. In 10th edition though, Titanic units don't have any particular change compared with regular units for that kind of thing. Though as I mentioned, it is maybe a little bit less important as they can fire out of melee now, albeit with a -1 to hit on most of their guns. It does maybe seem a little bit surprising though just how well a unit in combat with them can hold them up though. Say if a squad of Gretchen charges into an Imperial Knight, perhaps the Imperial Knight stomps most of them flat. If it then wants to move on and get on with its life, stomping forward and shooting other enemies down, the Knight can move over the Gretchen as per its own special rule, but it wouldn't be able to shoot and charge, as apparently the stress of falling back from the diminutive green skin is a bit too much. In reality, most of the time I don't think you'd want to fall back, you just have to shoot some of the guns at the greenskins and point some of the guns elsewhere. To be fair, I think this makes enough sense for a lot more similarly proportioned melee units plus things that they're fighting with, but it does feel kind of odd when he gets to the biggest stuff versus the smallest stuff. In the community post where I mentioned this one, someone did comment back and say that it certainly could be worse than a Gretchen. The big bad Imperial Knight Valiant is probably lucky that he's not in combat with a Chaos Space Marine Warp Talon. One slightly possessed jump pack guy with some lightning claws is really bad news indeed if this Imperial Knight absolutely needs to move on this turn, as well as being able to fall back and no longer either shoot nor fight. Having one or more Warp Talons in combat with you means that your unit needs to check for desperate escape if they choose to fall back. And unlike a few of the other units out there in the game, there doesn't appear to be any sort of rider that stops vehicles from triggering this, so it means that if your Knight Valiant wants to fall back from the Warp Talon, it's got a 1 in 3 chance of being destroyed by desperate escape. I suppose you could command point reroll it, as it's probably pretty critical with this sort of thing, but even then just having a small chance of making an Imperial Knight turn to Warp Fire Dust does seem a little bit on the ridiculous side. Otherwise, one theoretical army build that I believe checks out rules as written, and I have seen mentioned a few times just when 10th edition's allies and army building rules were revealed, is that apparently you can make a genestealer cult army with basically 0 genestealer units, no hybrids or acolytes or anything like that, just literally use Imperial Guard Brood Brothers, and then access all the great and good of the rest of the Imperial allies. If you take a genestealer cult army, you get to take 1/4 of your points in Astra Militarum as they count as Brood Brothers, so some co-opted planetary defense forces for the 4-armed Emperor there. If you're playing a 2000 point game, you could take 500 points of those, and then every single unit in your army has the Imperium keyword, as it doesn't look like you lose it. That would allow you to take an Inquisitor, which could be your Warlord, and make this entire thing work. Plus you could fit in a couple of retinues from the Imperial side of things, maybe some Adeptus Arbites to dispense some Imperial justice in the name of the 4-armed Emperor, or perhaps some Voidsmen or Navy Breachers. You could have a Vindicare Assassin along, and then even take ridiculous things like an allied Imperial Knight like Canis Rex or something else, maybe a trio of Armigers perhaps, and you could even take something like an allied Titan if you really wanted to. I think it's perhaps the first time that the Genestealer cults have been able to get their hands on something like a Warhound to stomp into battle. Obviously this one seems very unintentional, and isn't really all that good even if you can. You're basically just playing Astra Militarum but at a massive disadvantage. And again, seems like one of the things that Games Workshop might well patch at some stage. Wouldn't be too surprised if this gets brought up in their errata and FAQ once more. Finally, and perhaps this one being more of a core rules thing, is something that occurred to me a bit about the flyer rules, which to be honest in 10th edition are all kinds of levels of bad, barring a few ones that have some very specific cool abilities, or the ability to start on the board in hover mode maybe. Aircraft that have to start in reserve and also act as bombers have really big problems to start with. First off, they have to start in strategic reserve, so they're not going to bomb anything turn 1, and then on turn 2, when they turn up from reserve on one of your board edges, they won't have the opportunity to move over any units that turn either, so it means that usually the first time that you're dropping a bomb is turn 3. Then, with the general aircraft rules, the way that they work is that they have to move directly straight forward across the board, and hopefully fly over something where they can drop the bomb on them, usually rolling a bunch of dice to see if they trigger any mortal wounds on the unit that they've passed over. Unlike in 9th edition, you don't get to pivot before you make your move though, you have to move directly straight forward and only get to pivot at the end of your movement to basically line up your flight path for the next turn. So that means that your opponent basically has perfect knowledge of exactly the places on the board that you can bomb and places that you can't, and if you actually have bombs to the extent where your opponent's genuinely fearful of them, they could potentially just move out of the way with a normal move. Provided the unit doesn't have a really wide footprint or abnormally slow move for some reason, there's a fair chance you might just be able to clear the bomber's flight path and just get entirely out of the way of a bombing run if you'd like to. In reality though, even if they hit, a lot of bombers aren't even all that powerful in the first place, so there's perhaps only limited value to that. But it's fun to imagine that there's some frustrated pilots in the aircraft of Warhammer 40K, in some situations unable to have literally any chance of landing a bomb on their target if they want to move, as no matter which direction they point their plane in, the enemy can just move out of their way, maybe quite easily if they're a vehicle with good movement perhaps. So anyway, hope you have found at least a few of those entertaining. We'll be interested to hear your thoughts on any of those. Which of them do you think the Games Workshop might potentially patch out in future updates to the game, and which do you find the most interesting? If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming, with new ones out just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description if you'd like to help support and keep these videos coming. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some really big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.